Thank you all for being here today. My name is Andrea Bianculli, and I will be moderating this policy roundtable on the agendas and next steps in European Union-Latin American relations. This roundtable is part of the meeting we have held at IBEI during these last 2 days to launch the EU-funded doctoral network Understanding Latin American Challenges in the 21st Century, LAC-EU. We are honored to have a strong line of speakers with relevant expertise who will shed light on this topic, Latin American challenges, EU-LAC relationship. Let me introduce them in alphabetical order. I will start with Ana Ayuso, who is Senior Research Fellow at CIDOB, Adrián Bonilla, Executive Director of the EU-LAC Foundation, and Yanina Welp, Research Fellow at the Albert Hirschman Centre on Democracy at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Unfortunately, Manuel Szapiro, who is the head of the European Commission representation in Barcelona, was unable to join us today, so you might have seen his name on the program, but he didn't manage to join us today, but he has sent us a recorded intervention on EU-Latin American relations from a political perspective. I suggest we start with this roundtable with this video, and then we can proceed as usual, let's say. So, Carlos, thank you.
First of all, congratulations on this kickoff meeting of the EU-LAC network. Thank you, Jacinth and Andrea, for inviting me to participate. I would have loved to be with you and listen to, amongst others, the president of the EU-LAC Foundation, but this could not be, due to multiple traveling and events taking place at the exact same time. In order to prepare for this intervention, I was in close touch with HR VP Josep Borrell team. As you know, the High Representative is politically particularly active in fostering EU-LAC relations and working relentlessly to put Latin America and the Caribbean on our strategic agenda. And from the representation in Madrid and Barcelona, the Commission representation, we modestly tried to relay and support in close cooperation with our EU delegations across the Atlantic. Let me mention a few hot issues that will mark the agenda and issues that are front and center of our conversation with Latin American Caribbean countries. First and foremost, Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. Here, it is no easy feat, but we need to be able to show the potential impact dictatorships such as Russia that brutally invaded its neighbor and kills its opponents wherever they might be, as a matter of fact. The threat not just on the integrity of the European continent, but beyond, also with a global weaponization of agriculture, food, energy, information, and other common goods, which might have an impact and will ultimately have an impact on Latin America and Caribbean. Second hot issue would be Israel and Gaza. It's yet another catastrophe where the High Representative goes at great length to explain that we need to condemn both Hamas terrorism and the disproportionate use of force by Israel. All this seems geographically distant, but will bear heavy consequences on our geopolitical world order. And we are very conscious that both quantitatively and qualitatively, Latin America and the Caribbean matter. In July last year, we celebrated the third summit of the EU-CELAC in Brussels. This was long awaited. We're now working closely with the Honduran presidency and the Troika to prepare for the next summit in Colombia. I will mention the 3 priorities that would allow us to go beyond multimodal bloc-structured politics, with, as we know, a very heavy interventionist stance of China in Latin America, into a more multilateral approach. First, global justice in the form of debt alleviation, climate finance, green obligation, joint investment in global value chains. We're working particularly, but not exclusively, with Brazil and Chile in that ambit, international organization reform, global taxations, and many other topics. Second, insecurity and organized crime. This is yet another area where more, not less, cooperation is needed. With only 8% of global population, the CELAC region still has 1/3 of all violent homicides in the world. half of which are linked to organized crime. There is an increasing demand and also drug trafficking in the EU and the US, not to mention the development and interconnection of gangs and mafias. We therefore want to intensify negotiations for joint operations between security agencies with Europol and Eurojust and the recently created Ameripol. The third important aspect of our global cooperation lies in Global Gateway. This initiative, which now has more than 130 projects identified for a value of more than 45 billion euros up until 2027. The EU remains the first investor in the region. Hence, the narrative is key. We're seeking to help modernization, not dependencies through investment, to support transition in biodiversity, renewables, infrastructure, agriculture, and raw materials. Let us not forget that the Amazon currently represents 56% of all tropical forests in the world. Without the heritage of the American continent, the world would not be able to preserve its ecological footprint and build a sustainable economy for the 21st century. Also, the human-centric digital transition, we're extending cables, for instance, through LAC countries, putting into place Copernicus centers in Chile and Panama, having incubators for companies of both regions, and much more. During the Brussels summit, we signed, as you might know, a joint declaration on the digital alliance between our two regions. I could continue, but I'll rather conclude. We as Europeans need to be at once more assertive, but also more humble, especially insofar as our colonial past is concerned in this and other parts of the world. Before we look at the perspective ahead, we need to understand better where Latin America and the Caribbean countries are at and where they're coming from. And as the HRVP often says, we need them to speak up, to uniquely showcase the cross-fertilization of cultures and experiences that is in itself a compass in the complex world we live in. Hence the importance of this kickoff event, and also the fact that it is centered on better understanding Latin American challenges in the 21st century, and this is the job you have ahead. We are in an electoral year on steroids, some would say. In CELAC alone, we have 6 presidential elections foreseen this year in El Salvador, Panama, República Dominicana, Mexico, Uruguay, and Venezuela. Democracy cannot there and elsewhere be taken for granted. We have reminders of this every day, unfortunately. So it's more important than ever to join forces with civil society and academia. You play a crucial role in this. Thank you for your attention.
Well, I think Manuel Szapiro has already put forward some of the ideas that we will be discussing today. Before I pass over to the speakers, the idea is that they will speak for around 10, 12 minutes so that we have then plenty of time for the discussion among us all together here today. So let me first hand over to, maybe we can follow we have not agreed on this, but we can follow the way we're sitting or the alphabetical order. Okay, alphabetical order, let's do. Okay, Anna, thank you very much.
Thank you to invite me to participate in this roundtable. I will continue a little bit in the same line like Mr. Szapiro to contextualize the agenda, the agenda, the LAC-EU agenda in the global context, with a little bit a long perspective from the past to the future. I think all are conscient that the relationship is not in the best times, and that has been declining in the recent decades. And this is for many reasons. And some of these reasons are specific reasons of what is happening in both regions, like political changes, elections, as Mr. Szapiro said, or crisis or domestic economic troubles and national interests that undermine the possibilities to have a good and comprehensive agreements, like, for example, it happened with the negotiations with Mercosur. But other reasons are due to global changes, changes that affect to the global order, like the rise of China. This is one that this was mentioned also by Mr. Szapiro, the growing multipolarity, the geopolitical competition, and the contestation from the global south to the liberal order. All these are changes that are shaping the world and, of course, have consequences in the relationship. And both regions have to take positions in these questions, in different questions. And of course, the positions and the interests of both regions are not the same, sometimes are collision. So, but that doesn't mean that this necessity to adapt to the consequences of these changes, that consequences that sometimes is still unknown, because we have a lot of uncertainties. But to face to these positions, we need to do alliances with other partners. So we have problems, but we have also the opportunities to create new alliances. Of course, I was to mention the question of Ukraine and Gaza, but that was mentioned also before with Mr. Szapiro. But I think that even if we have different positions in the narrative of why the conflict arises and which is the way that we can address it, but we have still we share some principles. The problem is how we apply, we concrete these principles. And the same question, the same differences are regarding, for example, the consequence of the rise of China. China has been displacing the EU in Latin America. That's a fact. The weight of the EU trade with Latin America is declining because of the share of the China is increasing. And this is something that will continue, probably. But that doesn't mean that we can do things to improve our relation, because even though Europe is still the first investor in Latin America. So that means that we have a room to improve the relationship. And one of the instruments to revamp this relationship were the association agreements. And here we have good news and bad news. I think that Adrián will speak more about that, no? No? So I say no. Okay, so we have good news because 2 of the association agreements are negotiated successfully, but we have bad news because the Mercosur agreement, that was the most important, really, because it was the new one, and the one that it's still the main partner with the EU, filed to arrive to a good port. So this is something that I think will have strong consequences, bad consequences in the relation, because this is not a simple trade agreement. It's something more. It's to put together it was more than a trade agreement. It's a regulatory advance in the relationships, because now in these times, the most important in the trade goal, well, in the commercial relations, is not really only the liberalization, but the regulation of the trade. And these agreements have a lot of instruments to regulate the relations and to advance in a more equity regulations in a moment when the WTO is paralyzed, and could be a good example how to advance between two regions that have different positions in the WTO. So the idea is to advance in a multilateral regulation. So in advancing the creation or the establishment of regimes that are more aligned with the changes in the world. And the trade is not the only the only question that could be addressed with in the relations with EU and Latin America. There are other examples where the relations can advance in these regulation regimes in the global stage. One is, of course, the energy transition that was mentioned also, or the digital revolution. Both the EU and Latin America have different approaches, but both are negotiating their own pacts on, for example, on digital pacts. The EU is doing its regulation, and Latin America also is discussing how to address all the challenges that the digital transition is challenging. So this is and at the same time in the United Nations we have been also negotiating this digital pact that will be discussed in the summit in the future, and will be one of the first steps to regulate in a global stage this question. So Latin America and Europe can work together to put which are the main challenges and how they see how to address, to work in a digital transition that can regulate the digital rights and the digital access with equity. Energy transition is also one of the questions where the cooperation has become more geopolitical. And there we have two different positions, no? But at the same time, it's a complementary situation. Of course, that Europe wants the critical raw materials, but Latin America also wants to have more transfer, more technology transfer. So this is where we can be complementary and try to overcome the tendency that the region have been the tendency to the reprimarization of the economies of Latin America with extractivist model. So here we have also an opportunity to work on that, but not only this mutual exchange, but also to contribute to a better development of the regulation of this raw material, critical raw materials. That is also at this stage, in the negotiation in the global stage. And the third thing that I think we have a lot of opportunities, and we have to go ahead on that, is the reform of the financial architecture. This is something that is also being negotiated now for the Pact of the Future, and it's also we are in the first steps to renegotiate the new financial pact, global financial pact that will be in the conference that finally it seems that will be held in Spain in 2025. So this is an opportunity of Latin America and Europe to try to make together viable proposals and concrete proposals to be in part of the creation of this new agenda. This means how we can address all the reform of the IMF. This is something, we have different positions maybe, but we can go together to have a better understanding of what is in the negotiation. But because what we know, because it's clear that the current financial architecture is dysfunctional, doesn't work, couldn't avoid the financial crisis, couldn't address the sovereign debts, and also we have a big problem with the gap in the financing of the development agenda, the 2030 agenda. So these are three questions that we can address together, and as I say, we have already lots of conversations about that because in the cooperation with the CEPAL and the EU and also the OECD, we have a lot of work on that. So, but we have to work to put it into the negotiations together. So how can we create better safety nets to avoid the crisis? I am time? 1 minute, perfect. So the idea is we have to address, to be more assertive in the regulation at the global level, and we can do together with this regulation, this bilateral relations, birregional relations, because if we want to be more autonomous, as we want in a competitive world with more competitions between different powers, we have to have allies, as I said, and we have to have better regulations, a better funding, and this is things that we can do together. And that's all.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was very interesting, having sort of a panorama of how we can move forward in European Union Latin American relations. Now, I give the floor to Adrián Bonilla. Thank you, Adrián.
Thank you very much, Andrea. We are going to talk about a bi-regional relationship. The European Union, it is in fact a set of countries, and every one of those countries have some sort of bilateral relationships with other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. The relationships of Spain, France, Italy, Germany, for example, could be very intense in terms of bilateralism. Germany with Mexico, Germany with Brazil, Spain with the Spanish-speaking countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. But when we talk about the relationship between two regions, we have to reunite the European countries in a set of institutions located in Brussels called the European Union. If this region constructed around a set of institutions wants to have a relationship with another region, it has to construct the counterpart. Because we don't have, in Latin America and the Caribbean, a similar set of institutions which have the capability to put together all the countries. What we have is the Latin American and Caribbean Community of States, CELAC, which is basically an instrument of dialogue, of political dialogue between the governments of the region. It has not a telephone number. No, you cannot call CELAC. Hello, CELAC? No, that is not possible. CELAC does not have an email address. CELAC organized its activities around a pro tempore presidency that that is elected for 1 year. And this pro tempore presidency organized all the activities of this dialogue mechanism. But the counterpart, the only counterpart possible for the European Union for having a relationship with another region, in this particular case, is CELAC. Yes, we have also bilateral relationship, but we are not speaking of them in this image that we are creating. And what are the common points of both regions? What is the common agenda? The set of issues that are defined by the heads of state and higher authorities of both regions. And right now, what we have is basically a set of social issues in the agenda that characterizes the contemporary relationship. But at the beginning of the century, the issues were political ones. The issues in the relationship between the European Union and Latin America and the Caribbean, not CELAC, were democracy, human rights, development, of course. Right now, most of the agenda is defined by social and development issues. Because the current relationship between Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean is based not only in common values. Yes, there are some common values, but I think basically a set of common interests. We don't have a lot of common interests, but we have some of them that are represented in the declaration, the common declaration of the heads of state. The last one, it was designed in the summit which was held in Brussels. For Europe, and also for the Latin American and the Caribbean countries, it is important, if not crucial, to maintain the relationship, because we have a very changing international order. The international system established after the Second World War does not exist right now in terms of distribution of power and capabilities, political capabilities in the state actors. So maintaining the relationship, it is important in order to look for paths to adapt the necessities and the needs of the countries and the values of the countries to this new international environment. In a moment when in Latin America, for example, we have another influences, extra-regional influences, like the China policy towards the region, and always the presence, the broad influence of the United States. So the Latin American and Caribbean countries, because of the power that they have, they look for diversifying their relationships. They look for China, they look for the relationships with the European Union, they look for bilateral relations with the European countries, they look for bilateral relations with other countries in the world, they look for regional relationships with the South. The CELAC is looking for dialogues and summits similar to those of the European Union CELAC summits with India and with China and with the Organization of the African States, the Unity African Organization, and of course also with Europe. But it is not an exclusive relationship. It is not a monogamous relationship. After saying that, yes, the summit between Europe and Latin America and the Caribbean was very important. It was developed after 7 years of absence of this kind of encounters of the heads of state due to different reasons. Basically because Latin America and the Caribbean is not or was not a priority of the European Union in the last 10 years at least, and Europe was not the most important relationship of the Latin American and Caribbean countries. So having the summit, it was a very important step to maintain the relationship in this context. It is, despite all the different facts, an opportunity, a strategic opportunity for both regions. It has shaped and defined the common values and the common interest. And it was, the summit was developed despite the international turbulence, despite the crisis in Ukraine, despite the crisis in the Middle East, despite the different migration crises all over the world. And, it generated some common issues in the declaration. They tried to consolidate the commerce relationship. They identified some common challenges, for example, in terms of the environmental issues. They defined some common policies, and basically the summit produced 3 different sets of common policies. The so-called transitions, policies in green transitions to address climate change, policies on inclusion and the aspiration of equality and social cohesion, and policies in this so-called digital transition, which in the summit has some sort of public policy approach and not a technological one. The Summit of Heads of the State addressed the issue of the digital transition as an issue of access, not only an issue related to technology. The technological transition defines who is poor and who is not, for example, in countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. And yes, there are some social issues related with politics, for example, gender. Gender was very present, gender issues were very present in the Common Declaration of the Heads of the State. And my time is over.
20 seconds. You can sort of give
Well,
the
thank you very
final.
much.
Okay, thank you very much, Adrián, for this. I don't know if this is a very optimistic, but CELAC does not even have a web page. So if you do research on CELAC, it's very complicated. You have to go to, for example, the Colombian government has good information on CELAC, surprisingly, right? So I would like now to give the floor to Yanina.
So thanks, Andrea. It's a pleasure to be in this table with Ayuso, Andrea, and Adrián Bonilla, and Andrea Bianculli. And it's always a pleasure to come back to one of my academic homes, Pompeu Fabra University. So thank you for the invitation. Andrea suggested me to focus on democracy, on the challenges to democracy in Latin America and Europe. I'm thinking more in Latin America than in Europe, but I think many of the aspects apply for both regions. And my intention in these 10 minutes is to talk about domestic aspects and then try to translate or connect it to the cooperation or to what can be done to support or to work against these challenges from the international cooperation or bi-regional cooperation. And of course, everybody is talking about democratic backsliding. We have, I think, a very intensive conversation on that. Quite dominated, I would say, by the indicators. There is an agreement, BIDEM, Freedom House, Idea International, The Economist. There are some differences and some controversial aspects, but the general trend is clear. There is a democratic backsliding, and we are going back. BIDEM, for instance, says to the levels democracy had in the world in 1985. So this is the setting. But I think that to have this conversation, we have to go one step further. And I would like to organize the conversation around 3 dimensions, let's say. One refers to the procedures, the mechanisms that allow to qualify a system as democratic. I'm talking about the elections, division of powers, etc. The second refers to the state as a political organization. And the third refers to society and the connection between society and the state, and we can nominate it as the legitimacy dimension. So let me go to the first one, to the procedural aspect. I think here we can identify 3 absolutely key dimensions. The first is elections. I talk about that. And we have very good examples, recent examples, and not so recent examples from Latin America talking about how it works and what can be done. And I'm thinking on Guatemala, for instance. Guatemala, without international pressure, probably wouldn't have the presidency, Arevalo. But we have the president of Venezuela where the pressure didn't work and still doesn't work. There's a lot of tension in Venezuela. But there is an issue on elections. We have seen these controversial aspects, not only in Latin America. I think the United States is even more pressuring in this sense. But in Argentina, there was a conversation about that. Then the process went well, but this is there in Brazil, in Peru, in many other countries. The second refers to the division of powers. And there, in this dimension, we have much more commonalities, and probably the level in which the discussion takes place is different. But in Europe, we have Hungary or Poland, which faces also strong pressure on the system. And again, to have the European Union, as Adrián said, for other things, also affected how the region dealt, European Union, with Hungary, for instance, which I don't know, each one could have an evaluation of to what extent succeeded or not. Clearly, it was not a big success, but also I think we can recover some lessons from that. In Latin America, the situation is different, and we have a lot of tensions in many countries. And a third aspect, I think, refers to human rights violations, and probably we can speak as a very good example of El Salvador when talking about human rights. Then, when talking about the state as a political organization, I identify, among the many aspects we can take for this conversation, at least three that I think are really important. The first refers to the way in which power is distributed. And I think in Latin America we have a huge tension between fragmentation, like in Ecuador, is a good example, where it's a multi-partisan system with many actors. None of the actors has enough power to promote a political agenda, neither the capacity to negotiate with others. So fragmentation is challenging governability. But on the other side, we have concentration of power. And again, El Salvador, Venezuela, Nicaragua, countries which are not democratic anymore, but it started with this concentration of power. And it's interesting to look at how this spectrum produces, the problem is governability, and on the other side, the problem is the direct attack to democracy and the end of democracy in some of these cases. The second refers to state capacities, and this is a huge problem for Latin American countries, and we can see this in the extent to which the public services are not working and are deteriorating in many countries, and there are many aspects. I think it's quite clear the point here. And the third, and I think it's fundamental, and Szapiro also mentioned that, is criminal governance. So I'm talking about the state, nation state, but the first problem the nation state has is its capacity to control the territory. There are many countries in which this is not clear anymore. And it's not clear because these actors are in competition, but also because there are cooptations. Political actors are also quite well connected to these criminal governance networks. And maybe it's a very bad picture, but the good thing is that we have Latin American and Latin Americanist scholars working on that. And I think we have high quality information to assess what can be done and what's going on. So this is something important because it hasn't been so central in the agenda to take the academic production on this, and we have a very powerful research on this criminal governance. And the last is legitimacy, and somehow it goes back to all the other. What we have, very poor performance of the public sector, which produce a lot of insatisfaction. So the perception of democracy and the assessment of democracy is going down. We know that from qualitative research and quantitative research. And then insecurity is also an aspect in this sense. El Salvador, again, as an example. And many aspects of political culture are also engaged in these very bad valorations of what democracy is. So to try to respect the time to have, I want to close with three aspects in which I think the cooperation or the supranational, international intervention could help, which in fact is nothing new. It's things I think we have to reinforce and keep in the agenda. The first is elections. And we have, for instance, this year, one of these controversial elections, which is Mexico, where there is a lot of tension. There is some rumors made by the government on what could happen. There are also some tension in the opposition, observing that the government is controlling public resources to do campaign. So I think the electoral observation in Mexico will be fundamental. And I think the European Union has to be there, and the institutions from Latin America, and I'm sure many people is working on that, but it's important to put this in a first place. Then also in the same level, what is going on with human rights? This week in Argentina, there was an attack to human rights activists an awful attack, and the government did not denounce this. This is something that from the international organizations and sector, some reaction is required, because this is not only absolutely bad for the country, but it's also normalizing violence and justifying that. So I think there are some key facts that invite for urgent action, and on human rights also very, very important. Then the second, I talk about criminal governance, and based on this research we have available, it's clear that this is something that countries from the national policies can't really resolve. It's a challenge also in any dimension and way, but only from a concerted action this can be to somehow tackle and invites for urgent action. And then finally, third, from the many aspects we can discuss and talk about, I think that the public debate deserves much more attention. Because again, I started saying that everybody's talking about democratic backsliding, it's a constant bombing on what awful things are. And clearly, some things are awful, but the general feeling at the end of the day is that everything is corrupted, all the politicians are corrupted, democracy doesn't work at all, and then an authoritarian leadership will resolve these problems. And to somehow, there is an urgent need to rethink how the public conversation works, to try to moderate these approaches and to rethink what's going on. If we think in Argentina, in the 70s, the situation was much worse in economical and political terms than now. And now in economical and political terms is quite challenging. But we need to think in the public discourse on that. And the same in what refers to polarization. We have this affective polarization. Mariano Torcal here from the university is working on that also, that is based on hateness. So it's quite difficult to promote consensus and a democratic conversation when the public debate is based on hateness. And this is not only a Latin American problem, clearly it's also a Spanish problem, where if you look at the ideological spectrum, the population is not so far away, but if you look at affective polarization and elites polarization, this is increasing and increasing, and is attacking the possibility of having a democratic public sphere and discourse. So, yeah, with this, I finish.
Okay, thank you very much, Yanina. Thank you all for very interesting. I think we have lots of food for thought here, and we have around 40 minutes for discussion. So I would like to open the floor for discussion. If you agree, we can collect sort of 3 questions, and then you can respond to them as you see fit. So the floor is open. Andrea. Okay. Andrea, Jean, yes, please.
All right, so thank you very much. I think I'd like to ask something about the democratic situation, because maybe I'm biased because I'm Brazilian and we just went through Bolsonaro, but along those challenges, Latin American challenges, we want to understand Latin American challenges, and in the democratic sphere, I'd like to ask all of you, of course, you will talk more about it, but I think already you mentioned it, contestation of the order also, the threats of the far right, or the concepts are complex, but at least authoritarian, conservative leaders, to what extent do you think this is really a main challenge? Because again, maybe I'm biased in the situation in Brazil, but perhaps if you could expand a little bit on that, if this is really a challenge or past already.
Thank you. They were really thought-provoking comments, I think. And I will also pick up the democratization or state of democracy issue. There's growing work, I think more on Europe actually than Latin America, but I think it is relevant for Latin America, on the politics of resentment as one of the big drivers of the challenge to democracy. And of course, linked to the politics of resentment it's very closely linked, is the quality of policy responses to those inequalities. And I just wondered if, I mean, it's not really a question, but it's an invitation for observation, maybe, on your part, around this issue of the poverty of policy responses to inequality. I mean, it seems to me that this is something that we really do need new approaches in both regions to thinking about how we address inequality and the place of inequality in our politics. It's not just a social problem. It's increasingly an immediate political one. So I just wondered what your observations on that issue.
Thank you. Is there any other question? Yes, please, go ahead.
I have two different questions. First of all, as Anna was talking about, like the relationships, about like the new energies and the new activities that are economic activities promoted in Latin America, how would you do that, or how is Europe planning to do that without making or causing a reprimarization or deepening the reprimarization of Latin America? That's the first one. And the other is about what Adrián was saying about the LAC and not having like a structure or a telephone number. I think it's even worse, because if we look at the news yesterday or 2 days ago, the LAC president gave some declarations about Putin and congratulating him and everything. And then a lot of countries saying, okay, but her words doesn't, yeah, exactly what we think. But yeah, she did it saying that she was the president. So like they can't, or we, because I'm from Latin America, can't even like agree in a lot of things. So I think it's even worse, the situation.
Thank you. I'll pick just one more question from Patrick.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting discussion. I was very interested by some of your comments you did explicitly or implicitly about the state in Latin America. In a way, there's a big debate in Europe on what we do with the state. On the one hand, we emphasize in scholarship a lot of declining capacity to address some of those issues, including inequality. On the other hand, we see a new round of very activist policy and interventions in a different set of domains. Even in the UK now, we are talking about more interventions in a number of domains on Ireland. And in a way, I'm not very clear whether it's a debate now in Latin America, where we see on one end some very strong nationalization of some domains or interventions in some countries, and some declining capacity on other domains. So, number one, is there something to exchange more between these two parts of the world? And second, how do you see this debate in Latin America?
Thank you. I think you have plenty, right? Or would you like to take one more?
No.
No, okay.
I start? Yeah, thanks for the questions. Regarding the far right, if it's or not a challenge, my answer is yes, it is a challenge. Yeah, a clear challenge. And again, then the question is what we can do with this. And in my view, and we have the experience of Brazil, which was to somehow a successful experience in the sense that you got rid of Bolsonaro, although he could come back. It's a real challenge for institutions, and it's a real challenge for elections. It's a real challenge for the division of powers. And it's a real challenge also for democratic convivial. It's clearly what is going on with this. And I think the Argentinian case goes in this direction now too. And now, I don't know, we have a conversation, a quite intensive conversation on what can be done. And a recent book published by Laura Gamboa studies the strategies of the oppositions, for instance, formal, informal strategies. And we are seeing what is going on in Argentina in this sense. What is doing the opposition? Part of the opposition has joined La Libertad Avanza, other parties playing negotiation, sometimes not, other parties radically against. But now there is an attempt of nominating new members for the court, so we will see in the following months what happens, and the role of the opposition is fundamental. So it's absolutely central. So it's not that the far right arrives and then things happen. No, actors have a clear role on that. And then the second dimension is the public conversation. I quoted the attack that happened this week, and surprisingly, many people is horrified by that, and other people we still don't know. This week will be the anniversary of the coup d'etat in 1976, so we will see if the streets are plenty, there is hope. If people is afraid, we can see that the problem is coming. So I visualize clearly in this sense, and again, we have a lot of evidence and interesting works for this conversation. Then I think your question on inequalities also connects with the statelessness question, is absolutely central. It's clear. We see in Latin America that when there is a perception that economical situation, a perception and a fact, of course, perceptions are not unconnected with facts, the satisfaction goes up. So it's quite clear that the economical situation influences a lot the satisfaction with democracy and the aval to democracy. And this is part of this current, I don't know, tensions and evolution. If we look at what's going on in El Salvador now, this popularity Bukele has is quite well based, not only in the pacification, which is absolutely controversial, no doubt about that, but it's a fact in the perception of many people, and it's a fact also in the number of homicides. But it's also affecting the economy. Tourism is growing in El Salvador, so there is an economical recovery. Yes, it's awful, but it's a fact. It's not that El Salvadorians, no, they lived in danger before, now they live in peace, and the economy is growing. We all know, or at least I think we all know here, that this won't be a successful story, but today it is. So we have to understand that too. And then finally, quickly, on this conversation, I don't know what Adrián and Anna think, but my feeling is that the discussion goes in the opposite direction. The Venezuela, Honduras, Cuba experience is perceived as a completely unsuccessful story. So now the enemy is the state, the enemy is Keynes. So this is Milei's discourse, this is Bukele's discourse, and this is trending topic among the young people because individualism is also part of this trend. If you don't need to pay taxes and you can develop your own, this is a crazy story, absolutely connected also with the failures on civic education and with the information on for what and how works the state. It's not only about corruption and bad performance. Is also this division. So my feeling is very negative.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, yeah. Addressing the democratic issue, I am not very optimistic. I don't find reasons to be optimistic in terms of the capability of the international community to influence on domestic realities in Latin America and the Caribbean. It is not a problem only of the European Union. What can the European Union do to address the problem of democracy in Latin America? What are the instruments? And what could be the possible political and strategic cost of having an option of sanctioning, for example, to the Latin American countries? If the United States has demonstrated in the last 15, 20 years that does not have the ability to shape the domestic political scenarios in the Latin American countries, what could be done by other external influences? If the our Latin American structures, for example, CELAC, cannot do a lot of things in order to influence the scenarios in the domestic realm, what can be done by other international actors? So if we look at, for example, the experience of UNASUR, the Union of South American States, which was a very good idea when it was created. The moment that UNASUR was put in tension in order to solve the Venezuelan crisis, UNASUR collapsed. And the Venezuelan government remained. So the possibility of shaping the domestic scenario is basically a responsibility of the domestic political forces right now in Latin America. And we have also to be aware that the United States influence, the European influence, is not the only one from abroad that the Latin American countries are dealing with. So it is a very complex moment. And that is probably the reason because these kind of issues were not as present as in the past in the last summit of heads of state.
Thank you, Adrián. Anna?
Well, I think that in this conversation, something is clear is that there is interconnections between the different levels of governance. We are in a world, globalization is not only about economy, but also about norms, institutions, and values. And I think what happens because when you say the far-right movement is transnational, it's transnational, and it's a copy. It seems the same in each other. It's a transnational actor that is influencing not only at a national level, but also at the international level. And this contradiction between values and effectiveness, I think it's also at the international stage. And you see the competition between China and Europe is Europe put conditions and China no. And China is more effective because it doesn't put conditions. Now, this is something that we have to think together, I think. And governance is not only norms and institutions, but also it's a question of solidarity. Solidarity must be in the equation if you want to change the structural, the global order. And this is not possible without cooperation. So, and when you say the state can deal with all the problems because they need other states. There are problems that you need to work together because if not, you cannot fight, especially the criminal institutions. Well, institutions, no. But they are institutions, yes. This is something that you can address alone. Yeah. Yes, you can temporarily, you can fix in El Salvador, but then this is expanding to the other countries. This is in Ecuador, for example. The actions in Colombia and basically in Colombia, but also in Peru, finally decided the criminal movements to go to Ecuador, and because they look how to have their ways, and this is changing. Together, yesterday we were talking, I think, that the connections of this international criminal networks are changing their strategies when the circumstances change. No, they only find the way, the weakness of the system to go address. So this is we have to think that this is not only a question of competition. It is, but it is also the necessity to address the effectivity of the policies, and we can do that without cooperation. I think this is. Which cooperation? This is the problem. No? Which is the cooperation we need? And this is to address also the question of the reprimarization of Latin America. Yes, it needs cooperation. Latin America should work to avoid this reprimarization. but needs also cooperation from others. And this is not the question to choice between China and Europe. You can also have both, because both are competing, and you don't want to be the object of the competition, but part of the competition, I think. No? This is I think the question, how to make these win-win relations that means to address the global competition and the challenges that put to both regions, Latin America and Europe.
Thank you, Ana. We still have time for a second round of questions. Yes. Juan Pablo, and then you. Yeah. Okay. Yes, Juan Pablo.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your comments. I have a question for Adrián Bonilla. Thank you for your presentation. I was thinking about how the narratives emerging now for the European Union regarding world politics can have an effect on its relation with Latin America. And for example, I'm thinking about how policymakers and leaders in public opinion in Latin America are perceiving how the European Union is talking now about strategic autonomy, strategic independence, strategic sovereignty, are calling for rearmament, are calling for a war, a possible war with Russia, and how public opinion in Latin America is seeing that have been strong pressures from Europe and the United States regarding Russia, that it should be applying sanctions, diplomatic isolation, sending weapons to Ukraine. How these narratives that are emanating from Europe could have an effect, perhaps not very positive, on Latin American hearts and minds regarding this relation with Europe. And the second one for Ana, because you were mentioning about how the global context is affecting the relation. In the probable scenario that Trump will win the elections, how would that affect the relation, not between the US and Latin America, but between Latin America and the European Union?
Thank you. There was a hand up at the back. Yes, please.
Good evening, everyone. I have a question that I think is related to all of the comments that we have received before. It's concerning cooperation. My question is, what are the strategies that the EU has for establishing more of a horizontal, equal cooperation relationship with Latin America? More like trying to go away from the vertical relation that has been maybe in the past more relevant to these relations. I'm thinking, for example, well, Latin America has a lot of structural problems, and it's like sometimes the world can expect Latin America to run in the same competition, but if we address these structural problems, it's like we're running with a broken deck, and at the same time, it's not considered to be in the same level as equals, but more of well, how to avoid patronizing relationships, good cooperation, having in mind, well, the actual needs of the region, the structural needs of the region.
Thank you. There is a question here.
Yeah, it was one is how is diaspora affecting in the EU, like the bilateral and multilateral relationships? Because we do see like this representation of diaspora community in the consortium itself. We do see that in political leaders, in business leaders, etc. And I think it's playing a role in the EU. Then the next thing is like I do see that the outcomes of the EU and Latin American summit is basically the European Commission's agenda. It's like green transition, digital transition, and inclusion. I'm feeling like, is it really an EU-Latin summit, or is the EU influence on Latin American interest? So it's like, yeah, it's a provocative question, but it's like, are we actually like, when we're saying we do have diversifying relationships with Latin America, is because Europe is afraid of missing this more like exclusive, empowering influence of power in Latin America, and how is this fear affecting the future relationships among them? Thank you.
Thank you. Two final questions. So Pedro here, and then Juan Carlos, please.
Thank you for the discussion. It's mostly for Yanina. It's really interesting what you said about the state capacities and fragmentation of political parties, maybe. But and also the need of a strong part of the problem, because it's like cause of anger or discomfort or
Okay, so you have very provocative questions and questions asking for, let's end this with a more positive tone. So I leave it to you. So who would like to go first?
Let me go first.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Difficult. It's getting nice, you see, baby.
Yeah. Regarding the question of strategic autonomy of Europe and the reaction, the possible reaction of the Latin American and Caribbean countries, there are two basic documents produced both by the Office of Josep Borrell. One of them is this document on European strategic autonomy, and the other one is the Strategic Compass. It's a document related with defense and security issues, global defense and security issues. In general terms, from Latin America and the Caribbean, though, the possibility of strategic autonomy of Europe, it is not a bad thing. It is what the Latin American and Caribbean countries were looking since 1992, when the first Ibero-American summit was organized. It is the possibility to deal with a partner which is not the United States or conditioned by the United States. It was the past in Latin America, but somehow there are some genetic impulses today in order to diversify. The Latin American Caribbean countries want to diversify the external region influences. Having Europe disaccoupled of the United States is not a bad news. It's not a bad news, it's a good news for the Latin American aspirations historically. And that is one of the reasons also that some of the Latin American countries, or most of the Latin American countries, are looking for a special relation with Beijing, and some of them even with Moscow. Yep. Europe has, according to the polls taken all over the region, Europe has a positive image in Latin America in geopolitical and political terms. That is not the case of the United States. The Latin Americans appreciate the democracy in Europe. It is a benign external power in that sense, according to the polls, and it is not the case of the United States. And the Latin Americans, for example, they see China as an economic partner, but only as an economic partner. So there are some space for increasing the relationship. And the other issue is that, well, what the Latin American and Caribbean countries are looking for is markets. Frankly, they are not looking for more cooperation, because the budgets of cooperation, even in the case of the European ones, which are the highest in the region, are very, very small related to the Latin American needs. They look for markets, open markets, and that is somehow difficult to produce, and that is the case, for example, the negotiations between the Mercosur countries and the European countries, because the protectionism that the Mercosur countries see in Europe, and also the same idea it is placed in Europe regarding Brazil, and basically Brazil and Argentina also. So it is not cooperation, and it is, and I think there is no possibilities of Europe patronizing Latin America and the Caribbean. They have not the resources to do so. Well, maybe ideologically, but even so, I think that it's very difficult having Europe patronizing Latin America and the Caribbean. Finally, the last comment, well, if you look at the declaration of the last month or last week in San Vicente and the Grenadines of CELAC, well, you will have basically the same issues as in the European, Latin American and Caribbean Summit. They are somehow universal issues. They are not the European inventions only. But yes, in the production of the final declaration of the Europe and the CELAC summit, well, the draft, as is usual, has to be written by the host. So the draft of the declaration was written in Brussels, and the negotiation was really, according to the people who participated in it, a calvario. And well, finally, you have a declaration of 42 paragraphs. That is impressive, given the fact that any declaration has to be adopted not by a majority of the members, but a general consensus, which is to say unanimity. And we have it with one exception. Nicaragua opposed only to one paragraph, the one that mentioned Ukraine, and even so, the declaration was produced. So that we have to take into account. What does it mean?
Okay. Thank you, Adrián. Anna. No.
Yeah, because it's more related with. Yes, this is the problem of the declarations. That then everybody should agree, so nobody agree in all of the declaration. Respect the how to make more horizontal the cooperation with Latin America. I think this is something that is happening, but not only because Europe or the EU is taking a different approach. This is happening because other actors are more influence in Latin America. So Latin America is not so dependent, and the EU don't have so much influence. And also, the EU is becoming more dependent from Latin America. This technological transition and the energy transitions makes Latin America more critical or more interesting, more geopolitical interest for the EU. So the horizontality is something that happens because the asymmetries are declining, but still there are a lot of asymmetries. And you said, yes, the agenda is the agenda of the EU. Yes, because the EU have a common agenda, and Latin America has a fragmented agenda. So the one that has more power is the one that is with consensus. It's normal, and so it's something that is on the other side, no? How the Latin America can have a common agenda to really be more symmetrical, the situation in the negotiations. regarding Trump, I agree with my concerns. Is more what will happen with the relations between EU and United States with Trump. This is the big problem. The relations between Latin America and Europe, I think, are affected, of course, because what happened in the United States is important for all the world and will affect. But it's not so, I think it's more for the international or the global situations than in the bilateral relations. And the diaspora, I don't know if I understood very much. Maybe you have more. But I think the influence of the diaspora is good because it's the way that the societies create more links. And now the diaspora sometimes is a circular diaspora because people who come to work to Europe then go back to the countries and the opposite. So I think this is really a good influence in the creation of links between both societies and to fight against the stereotypes and things like that. No? I think.
Okay, Yanina.
Well, yeah, I start with the diaspora. But your question was about the European Union or in general?
Yeah, understanding like those links, you know, and how like diaspora is also bridging challenges, etc., like and bridging relationships at the political, at the economic, etc.
Well, yeah.
Like if this is analyzed or like.
I think it's an enormous question. I could maybe just 3 footnotes. If you think in Cuba, the diaspora now is affecting the demonstrations. To somehow is the Hirschmanian example is exit, is weakening the possibilities of the opposition, despite there are movements again. If you think in the academic environment, I think we are creating networks, very powerful networks, and this idea of fuga de cerebros is not valid anymore, because in fact, the ones who are outside are bringing projects, money, connections, and it's so enormous, very good point, up for a seminar.
For the doctoral network, right? So we're bringing here Latin Americans who are there, Latin Americans who are here.
So yeah, let me, a few words about the other 2 questions I had. What happens when the opposition is a problem? Yeah, this is also an enormous question, because what I was trying to do with my short intervention was to take a kind of regional picture. And when I spoke about concentration of power and fragmentation, I spoke about trends. So in some countries, you have the problem as a problem of fragmentation of the legislative and partisan power, so it's not possible to promote agendas. And then in other countries, it's concentration. But then connecting to your question, the opposition, yeah, we have to look at each country and see what happens. And again, we have the case of Venezuela in 2002. What happened was a coup d'etat by the opposition. So it was not a mistake. It was a non-democratic practice, by the way, recognized quickly by President Aznar at the time. So connections also. No. And then the future scenarios. I think this is not the approach, you know, to look for, because I agree, yes, we have this human rights, inter-American system of, but this is not the approach, and it's not, I think we have to differentiate, maybe if you want for something more optimistic, what is the general picture and what is the dynamics. If you ask me for Argentina now, I really don't know what we will be saying at the end of the year. Maybe the strategies of the opposition and civil society reactivate and it works. We can think here, we have Professor Valdez from UNAM. We have been discussing about Mexico a lot. Let's see what happens at the end of the year. Could be dramatic, or could be a scenario in which things are opening to somehow. We don't know. That's why my call was to look at the electoral process now, because now is the time, and to look at Argentina, what is happening with human rights and the public conversation, because it's now where there is a possibility to intervene in some ways. Then will be too late, as with Venezuela. So it's not optimistic, but at least it's a recovering of the agency. This is not just a thing that will be dramatic and negative. Let's see, and let's act.
Let's hope.
Okay, I think that's nice. Let's act. And there is a lot of agency in Latin America,
Yeah.
right? Because not agreeing to agree is also a decision, right? So, yeah. So, let me just conclude by thanking our speakers today. It was a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for your ideas. I think we have lots of food for the doctoral network. I would also like you to thank you for your questions and debates. And finally, just encourage you to follow LAC-EU website, because this is a doctoral network that has just been launched and will be running for the next 4 years. So I hope we have the chance to meet again through our different events, and thanks. Thank you all very much. Bye.